Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're here to give a presentation on why we don't go to the doctor. But before we start, we're just going to say hello and who we are. So I'm Jack Kane. I'm the Senior Programme Lead for Learning Disability and Autism. And to my right is Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea Matthews. I'm a consultant occupational therapist and advanced sensory integration practitioner providing clinical advice on the project. And now I'll hand over to Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I am a lived experience partner and I'm also a therapist working with autistic and ADHD women, and I'm autistic and have ADHD myself. And I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name's Anna. My lived experience is on the autistic spectrum, and I've been involved with the team for my second year now. I will pass over to Helen and Laura.
Hello, my name is Helen. I'm a lived experience expert on the project since it began, and I am the mother of a young woman with autism and learning disabilities who's with me here, and may I introduce Laura.
Hi, my name's Laura. I've got learning disabilities and autism, and I struggle going to the doctors and other appointments. Why we don't go to the doctor? This place is overwhelming. This noise makes me want to cry. My eyes are hurting. All the people washing by. I don't feel safe here. I can't explain where I am in pain. I don't like the environment. It caused chaos in my brain. It's too much for me to take. This place ain't for me. It shouldn't be this hard to visit my GP. And now we go watch a video.
It would be so nice if people could just understand where we're coming from, and that we're not all the same, and that it's not a mental health condition, and that it's not a learning disability, but we can all have both of those or neither and be autistic.
Every time I kept trying to ring for an appointment, just kept telling me to ring 999.
I'd like for people to be more empathetic and understanding with people with diagnoses, and even without, I'd like people to understand we're all just people at the end of the day. We just think differently, but that doesn't mean we're not the same as you.
You have to remember that autism is a spectrum. It's all ages and it's lifelong.
I really need an appointment, please.
It does build up the anxiety, just being on telephone, just waiting, or just not being able to get through at all. And then so often you phone up and then there's not an appointment that's suitable. That's half the battle really, is just to get that appointment. You might end up putting it off or rebooking if there's something else happens, so that is a bit of an issue. But when it's for your children, just to get there is the key. The journey, I know that can be really traumatic for some people, so if they're on public transport, it really increases the stress levels of when you're getting on the bus and thinking, am I going to be on time for my appointment? It's all part of the really awful journey. when I was younger and I had to go for sort of gynecological appointments at GP surgeries, just getting there was awful. I'd be shaking, holding onto the bar at the front, and I'd start, like, I can even feel my fist clenching now.
No, sorry, you can't bring the dog. No, you'll have to go outside.
We have to sit in the waiting room where all the other patients are. I do find a crowded place hard. That's why I've got my assistant's dog. My mum sits next to me. I'll probably cry if they weren't allowed in. If I'm in a queue, I'd get angry and frustrated.
Sometimes when I've been in the waiting room when it's been really busy, I've nearly just walked out the door because I haven't been able to cope. Makes me feel overwhelmed. If I'm in the doctor's and it's really busy.
If it's a barrage of sensory overload and all this sensory stimulus, you're not necessarily going to have that capacity to properly articulate yourself and properly take on board what the doctor's saying.
People with autism are really struggling to access appropriate healthcare services. At the moment, we are failing them. We need to close the gap for autistic people accessing healthcare. One of the reasons for this gap is poor understanding of autism by healthcare professionals and people working in GP surgeries. If we don't act now to put in these reasonable adjustments, then we risk people having distressing experiences, avoiding seeking medical attention and missing out on support completely.
Okay, we're now going to hear from Anna, Laura and Rebecca, who are going to share with us some recent experiences that they've had in healthcare settings.
Thank you, Jack. So the situation for me was an exhibition where I found myself in a situation where I fell backwards and broke my elbow. I was seen by paramedics at the event in question who were stationed on site. They asked me how it felt based on touch, but we soon realized it was more of a movement based issue, which wasn't until after we'd spoken to the paramedics and we were seen on our way. Initially, the advice was that I was given was to give it 24 hours, and if it was still causing problems, to visit minor injuries that morning. But the situation was that we ended up having to rush to the Alexandra in Redditch. When we got there, we found that the waiting room was busy because the Worcester had to close one of their departments. So most of the patients had come here or to other departments in the region. I was spoken to by triage. I wasn't offered any pain relief. I was also told that I needed to stay out of action from contact sport for roughly 6 weeks, which for the sport I do, which is dance, it doesn't fit the context at all. Which in my case, the most contact I do is holding hands and moving between one another. But I also got a lot of pressure, feeling as if to say, this is the way you have to do things. You'd have to do this. I don't think it was a case. I don't think it was a case of them deliberately putting pressure on me, but it felt to me like there was only one way to do things, and I wasn't prescribed any pain relief for a couple of days after the accident.
Thank you, Anna. So we'll move on to Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm only comfortable talking to a female doctor. My old surgery said it wasn't possible, so I had to change my surgery, which was it's much more better now. And my medical health is much more better, and they are talking to me properly. And they talk to me like an adult, which they should do.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. And Rebecca.
So I've got a positive experience to share about my GP surgery, and that is their fantastic online contact form. So you can take your time to say what you need to say and double check what you're saying. There's space so that you can add images if that's relevant, and anything else that might help. You can also specify when and how you'd prefer to be contacted, whether you prefer text over phone calls. And a recent example of this is that I had some blood tests first thing in the morning, and by 2 p.m. that day, I was updated by text of the result and what I needed to do. And that was that. It was really, really simple. And it's just a great service overall.
Super, thanks, Rebecca. So what is the Sensory Friendly Environments Project? So to begin to address some of the challenges that everybody's been talking about, Herefordshire and Worcestershire ICB developed a local assessment process for health settings, which intended to provide targeted advice and feedback and recommendations to create sensory-friendly spaces for those who are autistic and or have a sensory needs profile. We based that assessment and the process itself on information we found in the Green Light Toolkit and the principles within the It's Not Rocket Science report from the National Development Team for Inclusion. This is our local kind of response to, I think, a wider agenda in the NHS to improve the accessibility of health settings for neurodiverse people. And there's a few sub-bullets there of some national resources and information, which are prompting the same kind of thinking in the wider health service. I'm going to pass on to Helen, who's going to talk about why this matters, really.
So in 2022, which is the last letter report that has been published, the median age of death for people with a learning disability was 62.9 years, which is approximately 20 years less than the general population. So the general population are dying on average 82, 83, but for a person with a learning disability, that's reduced to 62 or 63 years. Quite a difference. The mortality of people with autism has also been reported as varying from the general population in different studies by between 10 years earlier and 16 years earlier. And some of the reasons that this might be the case is that signs of illness are overlooked. There could be diagnostic overshadowing, everything just put down to them having autism or a learning disability. They may be overlooking signs of illness in themselves by not understanding things about their bodies. Patients are denied reasonable adjustments that they're entitled to, and can also be influenced by a previous and negative experience of healthcare and just decide they're not going back to their GP because of what happened the last time.
We'll just hand over to Anna now, who's going to pick up about the process for how we go about doing what we do within the Sensory Friendly Environments project.
Thank you, Jack. So we will visit, so usually we will organise a visit to each surgery, look at the care environments themselves and make suggestions and offer feedback as to how they could become more sensory friendly. So whether that's a sensory corner, rephrasing what they're saying, whether that's because we can't put words to objects or simply because the language is complicated. We emphasize on the co-production throughout all aspects of the project. So as an autistic, I'm involved in this as someone who's able to offer a first-hand perspective. This is led by a team with lived experience, so people, whether they are autistic themselves, whether they know an autistic person in their family or friends, and what we find is then discussed and reviewed by Andrea, who is an occupational therapist and advanced sensory integration practitioner. And this is extended to all GP practices across Hereford and Worcestershire.
Thank you, Anna, that was great. And Laura, to say a bit more.
So the reason why we're doing this is to prevent people from dying at a younger age, so they can live longer. And people with autism and learning disabilities die a lot younger because they've been mistreated, they've been either given the wrong medication, they've been not listened to. Like, for example, if Oliver and his family were listened to, then maybe he could have lived a longer life and prevented all that from it, really. Also to raise sensory needs, like people could be sensitive to some noises. Also sensory can be like distraction. So like, say you're in a room where there's lots of noise, you could be distracted, and that will be hard for them to focus. So we're trying to improve people's health and outcomes, really, and prevent them from dying.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Could you just say a little bit more, Laura, about Oliver McGowan, which you're a trainer for, aren't you?
Oh, yes. So I do Tier 1 and Tier 2 training for Oliver McGowan mandatory training. And who was Oliver McGowan? Oliver McGowan was an 18-year-old boy that had learning disabilities and autism, who was admitted into hospital because of his seizures, and they kept giving him more medication. There was one medication that he told the doctor that he couldn't have because it made him feel poorly, but they wouldn't listen.
They gave it to
and
him
they kept giving it. They wouldn't listen to him. He wouldn't listen to his family. There was one point where they were straining him on the bed and wouldn't let him move around.
And
eventually, he died.
Thank you, Laura. It's really good to recognise that. And you mentioned Oliver there, so I think it's helpful to give a little bit of context about the training that you're involved in. That's brilliant. Okay, we'll hand over to Andrea now.
Thanks, Jack. So we have 8 sensory systems, and the information from the world around us and inside our own body informs us, and when that information is processed and organised, we're able to interact in a positive way with the world. But if we have overwhelm or other challenges from sensory processing, then it can make it really hard to do the things we need to do and to access different environments. So we're just going to think a little bit about how sensory differences can impact on visiting the GP. So one of the senses is known as the vestibular sense, and it's to do with our head movements and linked to our sense of balance and the way that gravity acts on the body. When we think about vestibular challenges, we might see that people have balance difficulties, or they might need more movement than other people. They may need to rock, pace or spin to make themselves feel regulated. So the GP surgery needs to account for the space and also make sure that it's safe to navigate around. The visual sense is related to information coming in through the eyes and how the brain makes sense of that. So in a GP surgery, if the lighting is particularly bright or the environment feels very cluttered, that can lead to overwhelm of the sense. Also, if the carpet is busily patterned or there's 100 leaflets all over the wall, that can really add to that sense of challenge in entering that environment. The auditory sense is to do with hearing. So noise within the environment, volume, unpredictability of sounds can all contribute to making it hard to go into the GP environment. For example, if there's a radio blaring or there's lots of pinging noises as patients are being called into waiting rooms, also background noise from hand dryers or toilets flushing, all need to be taken account of. The proprioceptive sense is the one that picks up on our own movement, so information coming in through our muscles, ligaments and joints, and we activate this sense through active movement. So moving our body and stimulating our muscles and joints is often the most regulating input for a lot of people. But if you have difficulties with coordination, or if you need big movements to help yourself feel regulated, then that can be really hard to access in the GP surgery. So we need to think about where people can access that movement, and also the safety of the environment and how things are laid out. So the sense of touch is all over our body and inside our mouth. We have light tickly touch on the surface of the skin. So if people are oversensitive to touch, often it will be light tickly touch and unpredictable touch that is really difficult for them. So that can be anything from the GP physically, I can't think of the word, physically examining the body. That light tickly touch, cold hands can make it really difficult for people to tolerate. Also, the feeling of rubber gloves can make it difficult. There may be things within the waiting room, such as rubbery seats that can feel sticky, or other surfaces that might not be comfortable for people to touch. So all of that needs to be considered. And then from the deep touch sense, deep pressure is often a calming input for people. So firm touch or weighted objects can help them to feel more regulated in those kind of settings. The gustatory sense is to do with taste and what happens within the mouth. So that could be impacted if the person needs to have an oral examination, for example, if they've got a sore throat, but also when considering the treatment, are they able to manage medication? Is medicine better? Can they swallow tablets? All of those things can impact on the effectiveness of treatment. The olfactory sense is the sense of smell, and when we go to the GP surgery, if you really tune in, you might notice that there's often a lot of smells. So we need to be aware of all of those smells, from if the staff members are wearing perfumes or aftershaves, if the place where people eat is close to where people are waiting, or if GPs are eating within their surgery at lunchtime. Also cleaning smells in the environment, the smells from the toilet, all of these things can make the environment feel overwhelming and make it harder for patients to access. And the last sense is the sense of interoception. This is the sense of what's happening inside our own body. And many autistic people have differences in interoception. It might be that they have difficulties interpreting the sensations within their own body. So it could be hard to know when they're ill, where in the body they're ill, or to judge the severity of that illness. Other people feel those sensory internal experiences very intensely, so they may need regular visits to the GP for reassurance, because it might be hard to know if they feel something new in their body. Is that something that's absolutely fine and not to worry about, or is it something more serious?
Thank you very much, Andrea. Okay. So a little bit from me now, just to talk about what the project's been able to do really while it's been part of our program at the ICB. So at the moment, since our most recent count, we have assessed 47 GP practices out of a possible 78 that exist at the moment across the Herefordshire and Worcestershire footprint. We are targeting 66% of all practices as assessed before the end of this year. The project has expanded to incorporate settings which are beyond primary care. So we've been able to look at the accident and emergency at Alexandra Hospital. We've been able to look at the out-of-hours GP service building in Herefordshire. And we've been able to visit inpatient settings for mental health patients in Worcestershire as well. And we've also been able to join meetings with other providers and organisations to share our learning from the project as well. And we've also been able to offer some face-to-face training sessions to practices. Is what happens when you don't click through all of the animations. Apologies. So, and we've also been able to share learning from the project more widely as well via meetings and conferences, including a recent visit to the OT show in Birmingham, which is where this presentation is originally from. Okay, so we're going to go through some of the recommendations now, and I'll just click through them one at a time, and we'll read some of them out. So I'm not sure who's going to take this one first.
Thank you, Jack. So signage review. If a surgery has information that's all that's various different posters and things attached to a wall, it might take a long time for an autistic person to read it. Making sure on the display screens that patients allowed long enough reading time as well if they need extra time to read through information on a screen, making sure that is broken, the information is broken down into bite-size chunks to allow reading time as well.
So auditory changes and adaptations, that would be things like making sure that where possible the acoustics of the room are dampened, which isn't always easy when we have to think about infection control, but things like carpet can help with this where that is appropriate. And also thinking about things like the communicative devices that people might use, ear defenders for if there is a lot of noise there. Usually people reliant on those will have their own, but it helps to have some that they can borrow in case they've had to come in a rush and don't have access to this.
Adapting lighting. So sometimes we suggest a dimmer switch, but if you're not able to do that, sunglasses can be included in a sensory kit.
And introducing a sensory friendly room. It's helpful to have somewhere separate that people can wait, because, for example, there may be noise. If surgeries do tend to use radios for confidentiality, although this doesn't really work anyway, because you often find yourself having to shout to be heard above the radio, therefore it doesn't really prevent the information getting out there. But anyway, having a separate place where people can wait that's got a controlled atmosphere, so it might be, darker, quieter, and have sensory kits available, things like that, just somewhere separate where people can go to regulate and self-soothe.
Reduce reflective surface, so laminated information sheets. We usually recommend non-glare alternatives.
Reducing visual noise. So this is things like having, if there's a notice board, ensuring that things are on the notice board and contained within it, rather than sprawling over the edges and across and around the room, which we've seen quite often. Also making sure that the information that's displayed is relevant and essential, so that it's not overwhelmed. If there's a leaflet display, for example, making sure they're not all stacked on top of each other and untidy, because again that creates visual noise. And as Anna just mentioned, when posters are displayed, if they are laminated for infection control, it's things like using a matte laminating pouch instead of the glossy.
Managing ventilation and smell, so making sure recommending a separate lunch area during lunch hour for GPs, making sure that the surgery is cleaned out of hours when patients are less likely to be visiting, but also in my case, alternatives to hand gel. So making clear that that patients can wash their hands at a sink if they wish to.
Showing staff photos, names and roles can be helpful, because then people know who they're seeing, and they feel a bit more comfortable knowing what to expect or who to expect. And something to bear in mind as well when providing the photos is, although black and white looks lovely and artistic, it does mean that it's harder for people to recognize, because everybody looks kind of the same. So a lot of people, if they have a bit of face blindness, for example, they might rely on knowing somebody's hair color to identify who they are, which they won't get from a black and white photo.
General improvement of accessibility to the environment. So if a person needs to leave in an overload situation, clear directions to emergency exits where they can get out quickly is something else we recommend.
So as we've already mentioned, reducing reflective surfaces, because the glare from these can cause visual disturbance, it can cause migraines and other things, which can be very disorientating and dysregulating. So that's things like, if there are windows within the building, seeing if you can get some sort of matte film to cover it, to take the shine off. And again, as we've already mentioned, and we mention a lot, using those matte laminating pouches instead of the glossy.
So this was an example of a poster. I also mentioned earlier about fear-mongering, and this is a very, very good example of fear-mongering. It's scary, it could frighten patients. Of course, I'm not disputing scientific accuracy, but I think if fear mongering can be avoided as well, you know, there are other ways to approach and discuss symptoms and illness.
So improving the accessibility of the environment by making sure that, again, it's clutter free and there's plenty of space for people to move around freely and things that they're not going to trip on. So, for example, the barrier in the picture here, although it's designed to divide the room, it's not secured to anything. So if somebody was to stumble, they'd get tangled up in that and it could make a fall even worse than it might already be. So things like that need to be considered.
So the reduction of visual noise, again, I think, again, making sure that information is organised, broken down into more easily processed chunks. Making sure that it's easily processed, particularly if you've got someone who needs more reading time.
Great, thank you both.
So I'm just going to talk you through an actual example of a surgery we went to see and the recommendations we made. This is a case study of Spring Gardens in Worcester. We first went there about 18 months ago, and when we went back to see if they'd acted on any of our recommendations, they'd done a really excellent job, and these were some of the things they'd done. They'd introduced a sensory space at the edge of both waiting rooms away from the general waiting area, and in each they had 2 waiting rooms, and in each of these 2 waiting rooms they'd provided a Zoomer rocker chair, which is brought, they continually move and provide a sort of regulation for people who need that. Every GP was able to choose sensory objects from the kit box that we recommended, and they could pick some to have in their own room. There were communication fans, puppet toys, clickers, visual equipment. And this practice asked each GP to choose what they would like. And some more things they had done. They had an outdoor courtyard which was unused the first time we went, so we recommended that they had a door opening into it so that could be a lovely quiet waiting space outdoors, but right beside the main waiting room. We recommended that they had clearer direction signs to guide people around the building. It was a bit higgledy-piggledy as some of the older surgeries are, and people need to know, you know, where reception is, which way's the way out when they come out of a doctor's room, where the toilets are. And we were very pleased to see they'd put a lovely sign saying assistance dogs were welcome at the door. Laura has an assistance dog that she brings everywhere with her.
Yeah, I've got an assistance dog that I bring everywhere to my appointments, and it makes my appointments a lot easier.
And one of the signs here in the picture, bloods and tests, that replaced a sign that said phlebotomy. That we pointed out that nobody really could understand what that meant, if they could even say the word.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
So we remove jargon and speak in plain English.
Talk about blood tests. The reason why my mum wanted to change that is because I was struggling saying phlebotomy.
Yes.
I can sort of say it, but I struggle with that word.
It's a medical jargon word.
Thank you both. Thank you, Helen. Oh, there's one more.
Yeah,
sorry, Helen, that's my fault.
I did mention that, yeah.
We've covered that, haven't we? Okay, great.
So, I'm going to talk about
Laura.
a sensory kit that we bring around to every surgery when we visit, and then they get a sensory kit sent to them. So in that sensory kit box, you get equipment for muscle work.
That's these.
So you've got these stretchy band things. Then you've got equipment for movement, which is the wobble thing.
Wobble cushion.
Wobble cushion. Then you've got ear defenders, which makes it less quiet. A weighted lap pad, which makes it make them relax more. So it provides deep pressure and makes the appointments. We've got some balls that you can squeeze. You've got some textile balls. You've got poppet. You've got a poppet that's got a spinner. You've got a clicker. You've got a whiteboard. You've got these communication vans, and then you've got these vision things. So all of those are in the sensory kit box. If you want to get any more stuff with the budget, you can speak to Sensory Direct, which is the people providing us with the kit box.
And could I just add to that, that I think one of the key takeaways is that when we've been to the GP surgeries, we're asking them to neutralise the sensory environment. We're asking them to make it as neutral as possible so that people can then add in what they need. So the kit box should allow extra sensory input to be added to the preference of the individual without everybody being exposed to things that might make it harder for them to access their GP.
Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, let's see if I've missed any of the bullet points off. I have. There's one more there about visual and tactile objects. Does anybody want to add anything?
Yes, Laura.
Another sensory thing that me and my mum noticed is the fire alarm. Make sure it's not tested while the patient's in the building, because we went to a surgery and Mum, do you want to explain more about that?
Yeah, the fire alarm test went off while we were there, and the practice manager didn't even react to it. And then eventually she said, oh yes, that goes off every Wednesday afternoon at 2. So the patients in the waiting room hadn't had a warning, and nobody knew it was happening, and it was really loud, but she'd just become used to it and didn't hear it in the same way everyone else did.
I've been there with that.
For example, Anna suffers really badly with loud fire noises and tests, and she often grabs her ear defenders. Don't you, Anna?
Yeah. In a situation where I wouldn't have my ear defenders, my initial response to loud noises is hands over my ears. But of course, this was another situation which occurred when during my recovery from my broken elbow, and because it was very early, still quite early on in my recovery, I wasn't able to reach my ears with that hand. Had to position my head very, very specifically in order to do so. Wasn't comfortable.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a good point to remember. It's one of our very common things that we look at, isn't it? The fire alarms in practices, and it's definitely one to emphasise. And I think we've given a good account of the sensory kit box as well, and all of the different items within it. So just a little bit from me then about kind of the project moving forward. So we're keen to move beyond really offering assessments and advice to practices about how they can make their spaces more sensory friendly. We're trying to move to a new level in the project really, where we're going back into practices and health settings that we've already visited, and having a conversation with practice managers and ward managers, etc., about what changes have been made, what the managers have been able to do, and where the challenges have been really in terms of making those adaptations and reasonable adjustments as we see them for people that do have that sensory type of need. And in recognition of the efforts that different settings have been able to do, so we've offered a kind of sensory friendly poster and email signature, so just something that recognises that this is a health setting that's engaged with this agenda and is really interested to try and make that extra effort to make their spaces more accessible to people who are neurodiverse. So This is a poster that's kind of in progress at the moment, and we're making some tweaks to. But this is the sort of thing that we would encourage a practice who has allowed us to come back in and have that follow-up chat with them. This is the sort of thing that we would offer to a practice or a health setting that's allowed us to do that, as recognition of their work, really, and an opportunity to advertise some of the changes that they've made. Some other steps that we're doing as part of the project. Let's see if I can get all of the bullet points up this time. We've got funding to continue the project for the rest of this financial year, yeah, we expect to be able to continue to fund the project beyond the end of this financial year too. We feel that the project has kind of greatly contributed to our local understanding of how the sensory environment can help or hinder patient access for those with sensory needs, and that's really all about what the colleagues here have said about their experiences in relation to visiting health settings and the direct advice and feedback that they've been able to give. So we've been able to collate all of that information and sort of see where the common themes and recommendations are, which is what we've been sharing with you all today. And we hope to do more of that, really. So we hope to do more revisiting, and we hope to kind of achieve a greater understanding of the impact of the project in terms of the changes that practices have been able to make as a result of the recommendations that have been made to them. So that we hope to do a lot more of that information gathering, I think, as a next step for the project. So we don't have Marie with us today, but these are some of the examples of things and projects and areas of work that our lived experience partners have been able to branch out into, partly as a result of their contributions to this project as well. So we'll go to Laura and then to Rebecca to share some of that information. So Laura, when you're ready.
I have become a lived experience trainer for the Oliver Gown Mantle training, all health and social care staff. It's Mantle training. So ask me about Oliver Gown Mantle training. So yeah, it's basically Mantle training, really.
And you touched on that a bit earlier, Laura, didn't you? Which is yeah, really fantastic to have you doing that and doing this, because it overlaps very nicely. And Rebecca.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, I already work as a therapist working with autistic and ADHD women. And I've been with this project from the beginning, like Helen and Laura, and I've loved it so much. I just wanted it to keep going. And then I thought, because I've got experience in employment and volunteering and things as well, I thought, how about I kind of apply a similar principle to the workplace? So I've since set up a similar service where I visit employers and I provide training on autism and ADHD, in particular training for management on how to attract and retain neurodivergent staff, and also in a similar vein doing premises assessments, policy audits to make sure the policies are neuro-inclusive, and all kinds of other little bits and bobs depending on what the organisation needs. And I've already worked with a lot of wonderful local businesses and charities, and it's been really, really great so far, and I'm looking forward to doing much more with it.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Laura. So we really hope that this presentation has been of interest to you, that you've been able to take some of the learning away that we've gathered over a few years in this project. If you've got any questions for any of us, either because you'd perhaps like to get involved in the project, that you'd like to pick our brains maybe about some of the things and experiences that we've had, then please do get in touch with us directly. Andrea's email is on the left and my email is on the right. And there's a QR code on the slide here that will direct you to our ICS webpage for autism, which has got a lot of information about this project on it, including some of the project resources that we've been able to develop, such as our sensory friendly environment checklist, that we use when we visit practices and health settings to assess whether they're sensory friendly or not. And there's also a nice little summary of kind of key learning and takeaways, some of which we've shared in this presentation. A kind of one-page document that will just give that all, summarizes that all at a high level. So yes, so thank you very much for listening, and yeah, thank you very much. Cheers.